Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to all our members and visitors. A woman went into the Edgware post office in Station Road to buy postage stamps for her New Year cards. She said to the cashier, "May I have 50 Rosh Hashanah stamps?" "Certainly," the cashier said. "What denominations?" "Oh my goodness," the woman said. "Has it come to this? Give me 10 Haredi, 5 Lubavitch, 25 mainstream Orthodox, 5 Masorti and 5 Reform." Edgware has not always had this full spectrum of groupings. I lived here in the 1970s, and I think there were about 60 Orthodox synagogue services per week, 3 a day in 3 shuls. Today, there are more than 300 services each week, 304. I think that's pretty accurate of what's going on at the moment. I calculate that if each service has an average attendance of 30, there are over 9,000 attendances per week. If each person shuckles 50 times per service, that is almost 500,000 a week, or about 24 million shekels per annum. A Jewish Tribune supplement in February 2016 quoted a long-standing resident of this area as saying that when he went abroad in the past, he was asked, "Do you come from Golders Green or Hendon?" They now ask, "Do you come from Edgware?" Someone who has watched this change take place is one of the elders of this community, John Lawrence, and was born in Edgware in 1944 and grown up and lived in this district all his life. Tonight he is going to take us back in time to the early days of the Orthodox Edgware community from around 1930s onwards. After his talk, if time permits, we will welcome short stories and anecdotes from those who remember the Edgware of the past. Let me just mention one. I can remember the late Rabbi Cyril Harris delivering a sermon in 1976 on the balance to be struck between religious life and materialism, urging people not to spend too much time in the shopping centre that had opened that week. You may have heard of it. It was Brent Cross.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lecture about our local community. This evening, I want to begin by thanking a number of people who have made this event possible. Firstly, the programme organiser, Spencer Nathan. My wife, Estelle, for all her encouragement. Alan Meltzer for his unstinted assistance. Adele Amius, in particular, for lending us her husband's file of various items of communal interest, as well as the United Synagogue archivist, Charles Tucker, and Michael Rudin, the librarian at Jews College, who have aided our research. Some time ago, I expressed my intention to author a book on the very subject that I'm going to speak about this evening. I had hoped that by now the written content would have been seriously advanced. But due to circumstances beyond my control, the desired progress has not been made. Due to the constraint of time for this lecture this evening, I hope that you would appreciate that I'm not able to cover every aspect of the subject of the Orthodox communities of Edgware, nor am I able to speak in depth on those that I shall mention. This is a truly enormous subject, which in due course I hope to deal with, as I have said, by producing a book which is what is really deserving. As far back as 1992, my former warden colleague, the late Joe Perlmutter, carried out a considerable amount of research and began to write a history of the Edgware United Synagogue, which was to coincide with the Shul's Diamond Jubilee. Some of Joe's efforts were published in the Shul's Muse magazine, as was a report of the dinner held on the 28th of June 1992 to mark the occasion. Sadly, Joe passed away a few years ago and is deeply missed by all who knew him, particularly those of us who had the pleasure and privilege of working with him. Fortunately, I have a copy of his 1992 work, and this inevitably has been of great assistance to me. In recent years, there's been a mass influx of new residents into Edgware, particularly benefiting the Orthodox community. Consequently, the infrastructure and the amenities available have dramatically expanded. There are presently 16 shuls or minyanim in the district, which between them host 26 services every Shabbos morning. Until 1986-87, there were 3 shuls in the district with just 4 services on Shabbos morning. Similar changes are now experienced with the increased number of daily minyanim for Shacharis, Mincha and Mariv, and consequently their attendant numbers. So, after almost 90 years after the Jewish community was first established in Edgware, we must ask ourselves the question, how did it all happen? For decades, there have been Jewish shops here, but now we're spoilt for choice with the plethora of retail establishments specializing in kosher food supplies, as well as several strictly kosher restaurants under rabbinical supervision. Before turning to the development of the community, it is important to research the general history of the district. The name of Edgware is derived from 2 words, Esgi, a Saxon name, and Weir, meaning a pond where fish are caught. Geographically, the main arterial road known as the Edgware Road passes through the district. This is part of the old Roman road known as Watling Street, which stretches from the centre of London to North Wales, called the A5. Consequently, the Romans are well known to have been in this area around 2,000 years ago. The area from the junction of Edgware Road, Station Road and Whitchurch Lane, heading in a northerly direction, is Old Edgware. It is in this area that you will find the entrance gates to Cannons Drive, leading to the famous girls' school, North London Collegiate. The area of Old Edgware that I've just identified was the built-up area in the 1920s and early 1930 period. It was therefore only natural for the Jewish community to establish itself in that area. Services for Yom Noraim were held in the first instance at the premises known as Lodge House on the corner of the High Street and Cannons Drive, and the following year at the St. Lawrence's Church Hall in Whitchurch Lane. These temporary homes were used for the years between 1931 and 1934. Now, a block of flats known as Lodge Close stands on the site of Lodge House. Needless to say, most of the now developed area of Edgware, as we know it today, was simply fields at that time. Green Lane. What was it that brought Jews to Edgware in the first instance? The simple answer is communications and affordable housing. Suburbs were springing up around London, and 2 brothers, George and Frederick Cross, who were property developers, purchased 70 acres of land known as the Edgware Manor Estate. This estate had a frontage of nearly 1 mile along what is known today as Hale Lane, and it was their intention to make Hale Lane the main shopping area. Previously, the London Electric Railway Company had obtained parliamentary approval to extend the tube in the Edgware direction, but it was difficult to envisage a train station in the middle of fields. The next photograph is of the land earmarked to be Edgware Station, with the London Transport or its equivalent name clearly depicted. Behind the station sign is another set up by the Cross brothers. On the 18th of August 1924, the first passenger train was run on the Underground from Charing Cross in central London to Edgware. There can be no doubt that the extension of the tube to Edgware assisted the builders who were anxious to create a new suburb. With all this came an opportunity for those of the Jewish faith to move out from East and North London. The building of residential homes in Edgware had begun seriously in the 1920s, and the extension of the Northern Line tube train service was the catalyst in its development. According to the JCR UK, the Jewish Communities and Records, the community was established around 1927. In that year, the Barnett family arrived in Edgware, residing in Grove Road. Being concerned to establish a community, the Barnetts searched the district for other Jewish families, and they came into contact with Leonard Lewis, Charles Farby, John Chapman, Asher Hyman, Solomon Lewis and the Michael family. Leonard Lewis, whose family hosiery manufacturing business was located even further afield in Elstree, arrived in Edgware in 1929. He resided at 59 The Drive, where many of the first services were held. In that year, services for the first time were held on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at the Lewis home. Whilst others were involved in the original establishment of the community, Leonard Lewis was always credited as being the founder, and a plaque recording this is now affixed to the outside of the shul building. Leonard Lewis was one of life's doers. He was an honorary officer of the shul for many years. At one time, he was an independent local councillor. He was also an active Freemason. The community held its first regular services in private homes. From June 1931, the home of Mr. and Mrs. S.E. Offstein in Fairview Way was regularly used. In 1930, it was estimated that there were just 30 Jews here in Edgware. And the first records of membership are dated from the 1st of April 1931. By 1931, the small community felt the need to employ the services of a Hebrew teacher. And after advertising the position in the Jewish Chronicle, a young man by the name of Saul Amius was selected from among the applicants. Last year, Alan Meltzer and I had the privilege of meeting with Sylvia Goodman, née Arnold, who was the first child enrolled in the Hebrew classes in 1931. Adele Amius kindly arranged this meeting for us, but sadly Sylvia passed away a couple of months later, aged 97. Saul Amius was the son of the chazan at a West End shul known as Minetta Street. He was a highly competent Baal Tfilim and Baal Korah, and it did not take long for the community to realize that he was able to fulfill the ministerial role as well as that of Hebrew teacher. He was duly appointed as reader to conduct the festival services for 1932 at a fee of £12 10 shillings. In those days, Saul Amius would walk around Edgware streets on Friday nights to see if he could detect lighted candles hidden behind the curtains of houses. If he saw what he was looking for, it was further potential for the minyan. By November 1933, the male membership had grown to 100, and the community was admitted as an affiliated synagogue of the United Synagogue as the Edgware Hebrew Congregation. This was an important milestone in the community's development. Consequently, burial rites were now available to members as of right, whereas previously special arrangements would have had to be made where necessary. The new community leaders recognized the opportunity for further expansion, and a local builder made it possible. And Mr. F. Hawkins gifted a parcel of freehold land on the north side of Mowbray Road to the community. The community, no doubt grateful for this gift, built a temporary one-storey breeze brick building at a cost of £1,150 to be used until a more permanent structure could be afforded. This building was so well constructed that it still serves as a shul on Shabbat for Netzach Yisrael today and is part of the site of the Tashbal School. The foundation stone for the shul at Mowbray Road was laid by Mr. Leonard Lewis on Sunday, the 11th of June, 1934. The building was opened by Mr. Gustav Tuck and consecrated by the then Chief Rabbi, the Very Reverend Dr. J.H. Hertz, on Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1934. A Jewish community requires infrastructure, and in 1933, Reverend Amius succeeded in bringing a kosher butcher, Mr. I. Koblenz, to the High Street opposite Cannons Drive. 1934 saw a major split in the community. I'm not aware of the actual reason for the disagreement, but it must have been along religious lines. Some of the founders, including at least one member of the Barnett family, left the community and founded a club that ultimately led to the establishment of the Edgware Reformed Synagogue. In May 1935, the newly formed Ladies' Guild, under the chairmanship of Mrs. Esther Lewis, presented a tablet recording the appreciation of the work done by the Board of Management. This is now set into the wall of the Beis Midrash in the present shul. 1935 saw the community begin its next project, to provide a communal hall and classrooms for the Hebrew classes. From the outset, this was to be a permanent building, and the hall was easily partitioned into additional classrooms. To enable the scheme to go ahead, the status of the community was changed in 1937 from being an affiliated synagogue of the United Synagogue to that of District Synagogue. The community undertook to raise £1,700 towards the cost of £5,100 and the balance of £3,400 being advanced from the District Synagogue Fund. The foundation stone for the new communal building was laid by Mr. Joseph Friedman on Sunday, the 11th of June 1939, and the communal hall and classrooms were consecrated by the chief rabbi and opened by the financial representative, Mr. Laurie Maltz. The date was the 3rd of September 1939. That morning, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had declared war against Germany. The communal hall was named the Rose Harris Hall, and both the original shul building and the communal building are still extensively used today by the Tashbar School and by more than one of the newer communities. That's the shul, that is the hall just behind, and that, of course, is the telephone exchange. At all times during the 1930s, Reverend Amias and the lay leaders were anxious to promote social activity in the new community, and as a result, the Mowbray Youth Club and other groups were formed to cater particularly for younger people. In 1940, the Reverend Jeremiah Fagan was appointed Minister Reader of the community. This appointment would have been temporary, as the United Synagogue did not permit permanent appointments to be made during the war years. Reverend Fagan also acted as secretary of the community, head teacher of the Hebrew classes, which were additional posts previously carried out by Reverend Amias. In January 1941, Reverend Amias joined the forces as an army chaplain and was temporarily replaced by Reverend Dr. Alexander Tobias, PA. Despite all the problems created by the war, it is important to note that services during the week, as well as on Shabbat, carried on as regularly, and this was very much due to the efforts of several elderly gentlemen. Their names were Messrs. Delinsky, Spiegel, Schwartz, and Jacobi. Mr. Delinsky alternated with Reverend Tobias to give shiurim Shabbat afternoons. In fact, Mr. Delinsky continued giving his shir regularly until the late 1950s. During the war years, the Hebrew classes' attendance grew rapidly, and Sunday morning attendances were at a level of 150 pupils. Reverend Tobias taught the Bar Mitzvah class and also introduced a B'nai Akiva group for social activity. Interestingly, it was during these years that the communal hall was made use of by both the army and who requisitioned the building and the United Synagogue. The army used the building as their regional headquarters, and the United Synagogue evacuated their offices to the ground floor. One important communal personality who temporarily lived in Edgware during the war years was the late Dion Harris M. Lazarus. He lived with his daughter and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Snowman, who were early and prominent members of the community. In 1946, Dion Lazarus was called upon to act as deputy for the chief rabbi following the death of Dr. Hertz, and until Dr. Israel Brody was appointed. The Dion was often invited to preach and take part in services. He also assisted greatly in making halakhic decisions which became necessary in the fledgling community. So far, I have spoken only about the establishment of the United Synagogue here in Edgware. This is simply because, for a period of around 10 years, there was no other Orthodox community until around 1938 or early 1939, when Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld established the Edgware Adass Yisrael congregation. The Edgware Adass came into being in a very unusual way. Rabbi Schonfeld, as many will know, was famous for his extraordinary efforts in rescuing people from Nazi Germany and Central Europe. In order to obtain a visa for the UK for a particular rabbi, it was necessary for this rabbi to have employment here. As a result, Rabbi Schonfeld created the community in Edgware to fulfill the immigration requirement and brought Rabbi E. Königshofer to Edgware from Nazi Vienna. Initially, services were held at a house in Broadhurst Avenue, and Mr. Henry Pells is recorded as having been involved in the community's creation. In 1941, Rabbi Königshofer moved to Stanford Hill and was succeeded by Rabbi Eberbad, who remained with the community until he moved to Sunderland in 1946-47. Rabbi Jacob Heschel was appointed rabbi of the community in January 1947. He descended from a long line of Hasidic Rebbes and was the son-in-law of the Chortkover Rebbe. He was born in Minsk, Mazowiecki, Poland in 1903, and in 1917, after his father died, together with his mother and 4 sisters, they moved to Warsaw. There he received his Talmudic and Halachic education at the famous Masifta Yeshiva established by the then Gaon of Poland, Rabbi Meir Dom Plotsky. Only pupils of the highest caliber in learning and ability studied there. On a personal note, my late father-in-law, dying Dr. Meir Lu, learned at the Masifta Yeshiva at exactly the same time as Rabbi Heschel. Subsequently, Rabbi Heschel went to live in Vienna, where he married in 1931. In 1939, he, together with his wife and daughter, fled Vienna and settled in London. In the wider community, Rabbi Heschel became responsible for dealing with poultry charlottes in northwest London on behalf of the London Board of Shechita. On the subject of kosher butcher shops, I recall Rabbi Heschel and Reverend Saul Amius standing together with placards outside a butcher shop in Hale Lane to prevent ladies being deceived by Jewish signs and entering a non-kosher establishment. This would have been around 60 years ago. And sadly, other districts, such as Hendon and Golders Green, had similar retail establishments at that time. Rabbi Heschel was a kindly, highly modest and tolerant man whose form of intensive religious practice influenced many in the district. Around 1950, the community moved to 21 St. Margaret's Road, where it remained until 1960. Thereafter, in partnership with the JSSM, the premises known as 261 Hale Lane were purchased. After using temporary accommodation on that site, purpose-built premises were established with a Hasmonean preparatory school sharing the site. The dates that I have quoted are contradicted by information that appeared in a brochure published by the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Communities in 1951. That is on the dates here. Rabbi Heschel continued as rabbi of the community until 1971, when he sadly passed away. He was buried at the Adust Cemetery in Enfield, and speaking entirely from memory, there was an unfortunate disturbance at the Levaya, as his daughter Thina, an only child, demanded to attend. This was strictly contrary to the Adust custom, and there were unpleasant scenes at the Beis Olam. Rabbi Heschel was succeeded in 1973 by Rabbi Raphael Kahan, who remained in office until around 1988. During this period, the community began a steady increase in membership as a number of younger married couples settled in Edgware and preferred to join a smaller community in preference to the existing larger establishments. In 1979, the status of the shul was legally confirmed as an independent community. Independence meant that the community was not affiliated with the Adas Yisrael movement except for membership of the Adas Yisrael Burial Society. This was an important legal ruling, as there had been disputes with Rabbi Dr. Schonfeld over the ownership of the land going back many years. In 1983, the premises were expanded by the addition of a new hall. 1990 saw the appointment of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Lieberman as rabbi of the community. Like his predecessor, Rabbi Kahan, Rabbi Lieberman had previously been in the employment of the United Synagogue. In 1992, the Edgware Preparatory School was closed, and in 2000, the Edgware Adas Community Nursery was established. In due course, I would come to other important projects that were carried out by the unique cooperation of all Orthodox communities in the district. However, the Erev project was led by the Adas and Rabbi Lieberman, and its success is a tribute to both the community and its rabbi having been established without controversy. 2007 saw the founding of the Edgware Jewish Primary School, now known as Beit Shvidla, at 261 Hale Lane. The school was founded by the Edgware Adas members as a Jewish secondary schools movement school. Ultimately, after many years of wrangling between the local community and the JSSM, the issue involving the property known as 261 Hale Lane was resolved by the JSSM purchasing the shul's interest, and the governors began to build a new purpose-built school. The shul immediately purchased 265 Hale Lane, the premises of the United Reformed Church, and moved there in 2011. And in 2014, an already established Sephardi minyan was integrated into the Edgware Adas community. I must speak of a past member of the Edgware Adas, a relation of Rabbi Heschel, namely David Moshe Friedman, who in reality was the Chortgever Rebbe. Born in 1914 in Boyan, he grew up in Vienna under the guidance of his paternal grandfather, Rabbi Yisrael Friedman, the then Chortgever Rebbe. In 1939, Reb David Moshe had a miraculous escape from Vienna and arrived in London, eventually joining His Majesty's forces. A deeply religious man and a Talmudic scholar of repute, Reb David Moshe would not accept the mantle of being the Rebbe and preferred to live his life in an extremely modest manner, working at the treasury. Edgware was deeply honoured to have among its residents a man of unquestioned piety and religious devotion, and was an example to all who knew him. Turning now to the third of the Orthodox communities established in Edgware. Here I'm grateful to the Yeshurun Federation Synagogue for the publication of their history in 2006 to commemorate their Diamond Jubilee. The published booklet covered the history of the community's first 30 years. The new community was the brainchild of Abraham Bernard Olivestone, who together with a handful of other local residents wanted a different style of shul to that which already existed in the district. In short, the United Synagogue type of shul did not appeal to a number of new residents who had moved to Edgware from the East End and North London during the war years. The Yeshurun Synagogue, as it is known today, was established as the Edgware Beis HaMidrash in 1946. Initially, services were conducted in private homes until arrangements were made with the church authorities at the site on the corner of Hale Lane and Heather Walk, the site of the present-day Adas. The first service held on these premises was on the 26th of October 1946, and the membership was 37 paid-up members with a further 20 potential members. Although there was an association with the Federation of Synagogues from 1946 onwards, it would appear that the new community was independent, having rejected affiliation with the Federation on the 27th of October 1947. The founding fathers not only wanted to build a shul, but also a Talmud Torah and yeshiva. There were clearly development restrictions so long as the community remained small and without permanent premises. There was an early attempt to purchase a site in London Road, Stanmore, but this failed. The Stanmore and Canons Park Synagogue stands on this site today. The second attempt was ultimately successful, and it is where the Yeshurun stands today along the Edgware Road, fronting Fernhurst Gardens, and this was acquired on the 11th of March 1948. Clearly, at around this period of time, it was necessary to cement relations with a communal body who would assist in financing the building scheme and be responsible for burials. This communal body was the Federation of Synagogues, set up in 1887 by Samuel Montague, later Lord Swathling, to accommodate the influx of recent arrivals of immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe. On the 3rd of September 1950, a new shul was consecrated. This is the invitation which was sent out. That is a photograph of the service that took place. And that is the building as it was. In the early 1960s, a hall was constructed at the rear of the existing building, giving additional space, and this served until the 1970s when a total reconstruction of the building took place. Thus far, I have made no mention of a Rabbi the Yeshurun. Historically, the first appointment was a Rabbi Rappaport, who officiated once a month on Shabbat and also over the Yomim Noraim festivals. This was at the princely salary of £75 per annum. I believe that the Rabbi Rappaport engaged was the same rabbi who some years later joined the London Beth Din as a dime, after several years of having been employed by the then cashless arm of the London Beth Din. It is unclear as to how long this association with the Yeshurun lasted. The Yeshurun did not have further rabbinical assistance until 1956, when Rabbi Maurice Swift, formerly a Dayan of the London Beth Din during the 1940s, returned to the UK as principal rabbi of the Federation of Synagogues and settled in Edgware, where he also officiated as rabbi. This arrangement lasted until 1958, when Rabbi Swift was reappointed to the London Beth Din. I would add further to Dayan Swift's Edgware connection in due course. In 1958, the Yeshurun appointed Rabbi Getzel Ellinson as their rabbi. Rabbi Ellison hailed from Gateshead, where he was born and educated. The rabbi, who also taught at the Hasmonean School, laid strong emphasis on youth participation and encouraged a number of young teenagers to adopt a more religious way of life. The rabbi, a great Talmudic scholar, delivered high-level shiurim to the community members and young alike. The rabbi also encouraged the young of the district to run their own youth club, also along strictly religious lines. Rabbi Ellison stayed with the community until 1963, when he made Aliyah and took up a position at Bar Ilan University. In 1965, after a period of approximately 2 years without a rabbi, Rabbi Ben-Zion Lapien was appointed. Rabbi Lapien, an experienced communal rabbi, had previously served as rabbi of the Ohel Shel Federation Synagogue in Willesden and was the son of Rav Elia Lopien, the famous Rosh Yeshiva of Eitz Chaim in London. Rabbi Lapien, a kind man with an extensive knowledge of Talmud and Halacha, was also a fiery and powerful preacher and a passionate supporter of Israel. He assisted the local JIA by making impassioned appeals at rallies for Israel, particularly during the Six-Day War in 1967. In 1973, he and his family made Aliyah. Also in 1973, Dayan Michael Fisher moved to Edgware from Hackney, where he had been rabbi of the Federation's Yavneh synagogue for around 30 years. Dayan Fisher was a Talmudic genius. Born in Grodno, his Talmudic education took place in several of the most famous yeshivas of Poland and Lithuania, one of those being the yeshiva of the Chofetz Chaim in Radin, Poland. Having served the Federation of Synagogues for many years as a communal rabbi and Dayan of the Federation Beth Din, which he assisted in setting up in 1966, Dayan Fisher had been appointed Rav Rashi of the Federation in 1969. Consequently, like Dayan Swift before him, he combined both his head office duties with the local Yeshurun's rabbinical duties for a period of around 3 years until a permanent appointment was made by the synagogue. It was indeed a great opportunity to attend shiurim given by Dayan Fisher, as his style of learning and delivery was an example of the great depth of scholarship of yesteryear, so tragically lost in the Holocaust. Dayan Fisher was one of the last links between the old world of Lithuanian learning and Anglo Jewry. For all of us who learnt with him, it was indeed a great privilege. In latter years, the opportunity arose again, this time for members of the United to listen to and learn with Dayan Fisher, as his home in Warwick Avenue was close to the shul where he was frequently welcomed and highly respected. In 1976, the community appointed Rabbi Gershon Lopien as its rabbi. Rabbi Lopien was a nephew of the Yeshurun's previous rabbi, Ben-Zion Lapien. Rabbi Lopien's early Talmudic education was in Gateshead, where his father had founded the Gateshead Kollel and jointly headed the yeshiva. He had subsequently studied at the Hebron Yeshiva in Israel, later under his grandfather, the distinguished Rabbi Elia Lopien, and then in New York under Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of the most famous poskim of the post-war era. Immediately before taking up his position in Edgware, Rabbi Loppian headed the Sunderland Kollel. In 1983, Rabbi Loppian was appointed the Dayan of the Federation Beth Din, but it was outside this body that he became nationally and internationally known and respected as a posek. I recall that on each occasion that I was privileged to visit the Dayan, as he became known, the telephone would ring, and invariably it was from abroad with someone asking a shala. The Dayan's reputation was such that he became instrumental in successfully influencing those who were leaning towards orthodoxy within his community, as well as many on the outside. As a result of his stature in the district, he was able to play an important role in cementing relations between the different communities in the district, and a typical example of this was his untiring efforts involved in the establishment of the local communal mikveh. For a number of years, ill health caused the Dayan to restrict his activities, and he retired from his communal position in 2006. Nevertheless, he still continued his rabbinical activities, mainly from home, dealing with many shalos and issues arising from his connection with the newly established local kollel, as well as giving shiurim right up to the point of time he sadly passed away in 2014. After Dayan Loppian retired, he was succeeded by Rabbi Alan Lewis, who had previously served the Bournemouth Hebrew congregation and more recently the Wanstead and Woodford United Synagogue. During the near 75 years of its history, the Yeshurun benefited from employing the services of several chazonim of high repute. Foremost among them was Eli Abt, who served the community from 1956 until 1963. Sadly, his departure from the community was the subject of a din Torah at the London Beth Din. On several occasions in the years ahead, Eli Abt would conduct services at Edgware United on Yom Noraim and on other Shabbat and Yom Tov occasions. Returning now to the history of Edgware United. During the war years, the community had grown in a way that no one could have foresaw. Whilst not all the annual membership details are readily available, it is, however, possible to appreciate the enormous scale of expansion that took place between 1940 and 1950, when one considers that the membership increased from 247 in 1940 to 941 in 1950. As a result of the increased membership, the communal priority became the need to accommodate not only the numbers attending synagogue, but also to facilitate the educational and social requirements of both adults and children. It therefore did not take very long after the end of the war for the communal leaders to realise that the premises constructed before the war were inadequate. For the Yom Noraim services, 3 services were held on the synagogue site in Mowbray Road. For 1 year, a service was held in the local Ritz Cinema. Foremost among those who led the community in those days were the minister, Reverend Saul Amius, having returned to the district after army service, replacing Reverend Tobias, who had officiated in his stead. The wardens, Solomon Goldberg and David Fish, and the financial representative, Reuben Candler. It was also in the early 50s that the community had a change of secretary, and Connie Abrahams was appointed to the post. At that time, even though Edgware was a relatively small community, we had a full-time secretary and a part-time Shamus Beadle, firstly Mr. Harry Unger and then Mr. Louis Grossman. Connie Abrahams and Mr. Grossman both served the community for around 30 years, Connie efficiently running the office and Mr. Grossman seeing that all was in order in the shul. Various rebuilding schemes were examined by the newly set up Building Fund Committee, and ultimately the present site was purchased from Hendon Borough Council for £2,000. The construction of a new building presented several problems, as licences for public buildings were not being issued, and there was a serious shortage of building materials, particularly steel. During the summer of 1951, London held an exhibition on the South Bank known as the Festival of Britain. I clearly remember visiting it twice, and there were various pavilions on the site. When the exhibition was being dismantled, the shul purchased the seal of one of the larger pavilions, and the original structure can be seen here. I think it's recognisable. The purchase price of the steel structure was £5,000. However, although the land and steel had been purchased, this was not the end of the story. Money was still needed for the remainder of the building costs, and until the community had collected sufficient funds, the steel structure was kept at Bushy Cemetery. Finally, during 1954-55, building of the new shul commenced, the cost being £130,000, half being pledged by the local community and the balance borrowed from the United Synagogue. And on the 2nd of June 1954, the Edgware District Synagogue changed its status with the United Synagogue by becoming a constituent synagogue. On the 11th of September 1955, shortly before Rosh Hashanah, the foundation stone for the new shul and accompanying buildings was laid by the late Sir Louis Sterling and consecrated by my father-in-law, Dr. Meyer Lew. By the following year, there was a shell of a building and it was used for the Yom Noraim services. After Yom Kippur, services returned to Mowbray Road and remained there until June 1957, when the new shul was able to be used on a regular basis. At around this time, another important development took place in the community, namely the establishment of Rosh Pinna School. As far back as 1948, Reverend Amias had started the nursery for Jewish children with the active support of the Zionist Federation Educational Trust. Initially, the nursery was run by Saul's sister Helen Silverstone, and it was successful, encouraging him to believe that children would progress in a similar Jewish atmosphere if only they had a school to follow on to from the nursery. It was always Saul's ambition to start a Jewish school, and with the Mowbray Road premises no longer required by the community, the site was sold to the Zionist Federation Educational Trust for £20,000. The opportunity now presented itself, and the project began in 1956 with one child. In 1956, it was not easy to persuade Jewish parents to send their children to Jewish schools. Indeed, not many Jewish schools even existed in those days. With the project The Rosh Pinna, initiated by the minister of the community, Saul Amias joined a very select band of communal rabbis ministers who had either initiated or seriously involved themselves in the establishment of Jewish day schools in London. When one considers how many children have passed through the nursery and the school over the years, one may reasonably conclude that this was Reverend Amias's greatest contribution to Judaism in the district. It is appropriate here to recall many other aspects of Saul Amias's work, as it is also in 1956 that he completed 25 years as minister of the community. I recall Saul fondly describing himself as the Bishop of Edgware, or on other occasions as a simple country parson, as he was involved in so many different but highly important aspects of communal life in the district, as well as further afield. Ajax was a typical example. After the war, a branch of Ajax had been set up in Edgware, and in 1950 the memorial candelabra was presented by Ajax to the Edgware United Synagogue, and its consecration took place in Mowbray Road. This memorial, as you will know, is now positioned in front of the Aron HaKodesh in the present shul. The Edgware community had suffered a large number of tragic deaths among those who served in the armed forces during the Second World War, and the names of those who made the supreme sacrifice were inscribed on the memorial. Those names, and I believe even additional names, are now recorded in the Liska book we regularly use on festivals. Saul Amias was extremely active in Ajax, and in my mind's eye I can see him marching at the head of the ex-servicemen's parade on Remembrance Sunday in November each year. Saul Amias was an ardent Freemason, belonging to several lodges. For nearly 50 years he served as chaplain to the Royal Masonic Hospital in West London. In recognition of his association and regular visitation to that institution, he was appointed by Grand Lodge of England to the senior rank of Past Assistant Grand Chaplain. Many here would have heard of the JACS Group, the Jewish Association of Cultural Societies with numerous branches throughout London and further afield. Saul Amias was the joint founder of this organisation, which was launched in Stanmore in 1978. It is almost impossible to imagine that Saul Amias ever had any free time outside his communal involvement. He was chaplain to several hospitals, associating the senior capacity with the Jewish Lads Brigade, and so it goes on. As minister of Edgware United, he was outstanding as a functionary, conducting services with his melodious voice, He was a first-class Balcora, to whom I am grateful to for his encouragement when I began to lane a few years ago. Some years ago, I came across a publication titled Addresses Given at the 20th Conference of Anglo-Jewish Preachers held at Jews College in April 1958. At that conference, Reverend Amos delivered a paper titled Praying and Davening, in which some very interesting concepts are discussed. That of kavanah, dignity of a Shabbat and Yom Tov services, communal participation, and the proper pronunciation of the words of the Tefillos by the Chazan. Reverend Amos, himself the son of a Chazan, expresses his concern at using the synagogue as a concert hall, but is even more concerned for the use of the traditional nusach, melodies or tunes, for the appropriate occasions. He quotes the late Reverend Morris Rosenbaum, then a retired minister living in Edgware and one of Reverend Amos's teachers, by saying, from the very melodies one hears on entering the synagogue, one should know what Yom Tov it was. In 1973, Reverend Amos was honoured by receiving the MBE from the Queen, and he continued his ministry of Edgware United for 44 years until retiring in 1975. Although it is now another 4 years onwards in time since Saul Amos returned from his post as minister of Edgware United, and the community has changed several times, it is my belief that the solid foundation he set for the community in the years of his ministry has contributed in no small measure to the success of the Orthodox community we have in Edgware today. I mentioned before that Diane Swift had settled in Edgware on his return from abroad in 1956. In 1958, he was reappointed to the London Beth Din, and consequently felt that his loyalties required him to daven in the United Synagogue. Consequently, we were privileged to have the opportunity from time to time of hearing one of Anglo-Jewry's greatest preachers, as well as benefiting from learning in high-level Talmudic shiurim held twice a week. Diane Swift's Shabbat afternoon shiurim regularly attracted around 100 participants, mostly from Edgware United, and as they took place before Mincha, it was not for a captive audience. So much for those who have the temerity to suggest that years ago there was no high-level learning in the district, or even worse, that there was no one to participate in or appreciate the golden opportunity that we then had. For those who did not know the Diane and relied on press comments, he may erroneously have come through as having been extreme in his views. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was uncompromising in his belief of Torah values, the standard bearer of orthodoxy, but at the same time a man of great kindness, compassion, and dedication to helping people, where possible, within the confines of the strict halacha. March 1964 saw the former opening of the new shul by Mr. Jack Miller and the consecration of the Pauline Glick and the Aaron Meltzer halls. The service was principally conducted by the then Chief Rabbi, Dr. Israel Brody. In the early 1960s, the community was honoured when Rabbi Dr. Joseph Rabinovich and his wife Ruth came to live in Edgware following the rabbi's retirement from the Dalston synagogue known as Poets Road. Rabbi Rabinovich, who also lectured at Jews College, was regarded as a world authority on the tractate of Megillah. Whilst living in Edgware, he completed the translation of many tractates of the Jerusalem Talmud, one of which, Bikurim, was published shortly before he passed away in 1975. 1966 was an extremely sad year for the community, as it saw the passing of two major personalities. Firstly, the founder, Leonard Lewis, who died in February, and then the Chazan, Reverend Fagan, passed away shortly before Pesach. I've already spoken at some length about Leonard Lewis, whose foresight about Edgware's future was so accurate. Cousin Fagan was about to celebrate 25 years' service with the community when he tragically passed away. He was taken ill whilst teaching a class at the Hebrew classes, and although it was evident that his health had been deteriorating for some time, it was nevertheless a great shock to his family and the community when he suddenly passed away. The Chazan and his wife Margaret were extremely popular figures in the community, and both were well known for their pastoral work. In particular, the Chazan was highly respected by the young of the community, many of whom he had taught at the classes or privately. On a personal note, as I said a few moments ago, regarding Reverend Amos, Reverend Fagan provided similar encouragement and help to me when I began laning in the shul. and I shall always remember his remark on the first occasion, "Don't worry, you're among friends." Shul services continued with the assistance from candidates interested in securing the vacant position, and with assistance from members such as myself, the late Monty Radberg, and of course Reverend Amius, who were so competent in this regard. For Yom Leroy, the services of Eliat were secured, and he, together with the Shul choir, conducted midnight Slichos services for the first time in Edgware. The golden era of Chazonim, for which Edgware became so well known, began one Shabbat when Chazon Moshe Stern officiated. He was passing through London on his way to New York to succeed the late Cantor Moshe Kusevitsky. Chazon Stern recommended a young but unknown colleague, Joseph Malavani, for the Edgware vacancy. Yossi, an Israeli with a community in Johannesburg, was invited to officiate in Edgware, and after having conducted services 2 weeks consecutively, was appointed to the vacant position. Yossi was also keen to further his musical studies in London. Although very young, Yossi brought with him a great deal of professional maturity, and during the 5 years here, he formed a close ministerial partnership with Reverend Amius and introduced the golden era of Chazonot to Edgware. In 1973, Yossi received a call from the prestigious Fifth Avenue Synagogue, New York, which he accepted and remains there for some 46 years later. The community had got used to the style of service introduced by Yossi Malavani and were fortunate to be able to quickly appoint a new chazan to succeed him. Asher Heinovich, also an Israeli, then in Pretoria, South Africa, took up the position, and like his predecessor, conducted services in a manner that was simply a joy to listen to. Asher enhanced Edgware's reputation as a shul where the highest level of chazanut could be heard. Unfortunately for Edgware, Asher's association with the community here did not last, and in 1975 he received a call from St. John's Wood Synagogue to take up the position there. For many years now, Asher has been a chazan of the Yeshurun Synagogue in Jerusalem. It then took nearly 4 years to make a new appointment. Meanwhile, Shabbat services were conducted by lay leaders, in particular Brian Lever, whose family had been members of the community since the 1940s. Cousin Zev Torum from the Western Synagogue was appointed in 1979, remaining with the community for 4 years before taking up a position in Montreal. The very last of the full-time chazonim was Reverend Stephen Robbins of the Wembley Synagogue, who was appointed in 1984. Reverend Robbins remained for nearly 10 years before moving to North Finchley and Woodside Park Synagogue. Since the mid-1990s, Edgware has been served by part-time chazonim, Shimon Kramer, Johnny Turgle, and now, of course, Yossi Schwartz. In detailing the story of Chazonim, I've covered the period of 50 years since Reverend Fagan passed away. In that same period of time, the community has been served by 4 ministers or rabbis. I have already spoken of the massive contribution made by Reverend Amius during the 44 years of his ministry. After he retired in 1975, he was immediately succeeded by Rabbi Cyril Harris. Rabbi Harris remained with the community for only 4 years until 1979, before he accepted a call to St. John's Wood Synagogue. In 1987, Rabbi Harris was appointed to be Chief Rabbi of South Africa, where he remained until 2004, when he sadly passed away. One amusing story I have of Cyril Harris is of us playing together for the Shul cricket team. He was a great fan of the game, and on the first occasion, when I played for the team, I was told that whatever you do, don't run the rabbi out. So what did I do? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. Rabbi Benjamin Rabinowitz succeeded Rabbi Harris on the 1st of January 1981. The rabbi had previously been in the employment of the United Synagogue as an assistant minister before taking up rabbinical positions firstly in Blackpool and then at the Yeshurun Synagogue in Gatley, South Manchester. Rabbi Rabinovich remained with the community for 26 years before retiring to Israel. He now lives in Jerusalem. During the period of Rabbi Rabinovich's ministry, the community celebrated both its golden and diamond jubilees, these being celebrated in 1982 and 1992. For the golden jubilee, a service was held in the shul on Sunday the 9th of May, and the officiants being the chief rabbi, as he was then, Sir Emanuel Jacobowitz, Rabbi Rabinovich, Reverend Amius, and Reverend Holland. As a warden at that time, I had the honour and privilege to organise the event, which numbered many distinguished guests. The service was followed by a tea in the shul. In 1992, the Diamond Jubilee was celebrated by there being the Diamond Jubilee Week of Welcome, organised by Jenny Perlmutter and Gerald Gershon, when a host of different events took place throughout the week. The Diamond Jubilee dinner took place on the 25th of June, the host being Reverend Amius. During the course of the evening, a portrait of Reverend Amius that had been painted and donated by Mrs. Marlene Sackheim was presented to Reverend Amius. The guest of honour for the occasion was the Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. During Rabbi Willis's ministry, the Hashkoma service began to function, and in 1985, holding their regular Shabbat services in the Beis Midrash. A number of members have requested this service as an alternative to the main service. About 15 years previously, the youth service had been established, and with the creation of the Hashkoma, it now meant that there were 3 regular Shabbat services being held on the shul premises. The youth service had been extremely successful, and at that time it was only such service in the district. Today, as many will know, there are 4 or 5 services every Shabbat, depending on whether the Emet service is taking place. Rabbi David Lister took up his ministerial position in January 2008, having previously served as the Reading and Maswell Hill communities. During the past 11 years, Rabbi Lister has energized the community in a way that previously never seemed possible, and in doing so has endeared himself to all. He has been totally supported by his wife Rachel, and we look forward to their and their family association with our community for many years to come in good health. Up to this point, I've spoken of the history of the 3 shuls that existed in the district until 1986. I think that it must be clear to all that by 1986, the community, being over 50 years old, was by then very well established. The first of what has become a plethora of different types of shuls was the establishment of the Stiebel by Rabbi Schneeberg in 1986. Not long after that, Rabbi Sudak, who had come to Edgware in 1984 and integrated himself into the wider community, he worshipped regularly with us at Edgware United and had become a very much respected and admired figure. Rabbi Sudak's work has become legendary, and we are deeply honoured to have him with us in our midst. By the late 1990s, Seed had set up their own shul. In 1998, Kol Yaakov began as a very small, almost private minyan on the Mowbray Parade, moving to 2 houses in Mowbray Road a few years later. In 2006, it was boosted by the establishment of the kollel using the premises. Now the kollel has its own premises in Mowbray House. In the last few years, the Sephardi community have built a new purpose-built shul on the corner of Edgerberry Lane and Edgerberry Gardens. Previously, the community occupied part of the premises belonged to the Stiebel. Its rabbinical leader is Rabbi Jonathan Menachem. Several of the smaller communities established in recent years have splintered away from Kol Yaakov and the kollel, catering for the influx of young families who have settled in the district. This influx has required the expansion of educational facilities, and further schools were necessary to cater for boys and girls to avoid them to travel to other districts for their education. Tashbah School for Boys operates from premises in Mowbray Road, and the equivalent girls' school operates from the Stiebel premises in the Drive. Turning now to the examples where the Orthodox communities have achieved so much by joint cooperation. In other words, Achdus. In 1981, Project Seed began its one-to-one learning in the district. It was agreed that each of the 3 communities would host the project for a term, and the facility would move around the district. Around the same time, the 3 communities agreed to fund the cost of a youth area officer to be responsible for organising youth activities. The Youth Area Officer project was a key part of the United Synagogue's Youth and Community Services policy, and the 2 other synagogues were very happy to join in and contribute financially in accordance with their membership ratio. Having cemented this relationship in educational matters, it was not difficult in the mid-1980s to establish a working partnership with the Yeshuron for Chevra Kedisha matters, so as to avoid the traditional reliance on the head on the respective head offices. The Adas did not participate in this at the time, as that community was entirely composed of very young members. To establish our own local chevra, it was necessary to train local volunteers. The Edgware team were trained by Kingsbridge volunteers, they having been trained by Hendon Adas. Edgware became the second United Synagogue to establish its own chevra Kedisha, which I again stress was in partnership with the Yeshurun. Many other communities almost immediately took their lead from us. Another cross-community project began in the early part of 1984. For a number of years, there have been various attempts without success to establish a mikveh in the district. Local planning was very much an obstacle, as well as finding a suitable site. A new committee was set up of representatives of the three shuls, as well as Stanmore and Mill Hill, and with agreement for the United Synagogue, the site adjacent to the car park here was designated. The project took 7 years to come to fruition, particularly as funding was required for both building costs and ongoing maintenance. And although the United Synagogue had been extremely helpful, I'm obliged to point out that none of the financial burden was allowed to fall on either United Synagogue or the Edgware Synagogue. Consequently, the local committee running the mikveh has always been totally independent of all synagogues in the area. Raising the necessary funds was very much in the hands of the late Stanley Chesler, the Yeshurun representative, and in this regard, the Sassover Rebbe, Diane Ehrentreu, Diane Lopian were instrumental. After about 7 years of planning, fundraising, etc., the mikveh was opened in 1991 by the Chief Rabbi of Israel, Chief Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, together with Mr. Erwin Landau. I've already mentioned the other project that was introduced locally with cooperation between the existing synagogues. By this, I again refer to the Eruv pioneered by Rabbi Lieberman and the Adass. Hatzolah is yet a further example of volunteers from the Orthodox communities joining together to provide emergency medical assistance locally. In recent years, some London communities have disintegrated and many of their committee members have moved to Edgware. We've also been joined by a number of families from the provinces, and this has strengthened our community. This influence has encouraged those business people specialising in the kosher trade to open new establishments, in particular additional bakery shops, butchers and mini-markets, as well as a seemingly unending plethora of restaurants. However, no one should be under any illusions that over the years we have not been well served by other kosher establishments in this regard. As far back as I can remember, there were 5 or 6 kosher butchers in Edgware. Brzezinski's had their shop on the Mowbray Parade, as well as there have been several grocery shops. I began this lecture by speaking about a group of people, originally unconnected, who came together nearly 90 years ago to form what has now become a highly respected community of major importance in Anglo Jewry. Inevitably, the founders have sadly moved on. Having been born here in Edgware and spent the whole of my life in this district, I've witnessed at first hand the development of the community and all it stands for. I've been privileged to serve the Edgware United Synagogue over the years in many capacities, as a Baltfiller, Balcoa, and it is almost 50 years since I first became involved in the affairs of communal administration, including 5 years spent as warden. During this lengthy period of time, I've worked with some devoted persons totally committed to the community. Among the most committed was my late co-warden and friend Joe Perlmutter, with whom I worked so closely. And it is to Joe that I dedicate this lecture this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Would anyone like to make a contribution to what John has said? No?
I'd like to say a few words, if I may. I know quite a few people know me. I'm the daughter of the late Simon Dom, and what John has said tonight has really been a story of my Jewish life and the way, growing up in Edgware, I'm now 75, I was here from a little child, and I grew up going to the Mowbray Road Shul, sitting on my father's lap, loving the chazanot of Reverend Fagan. Every time I go to Bushy, I stop at his graveside. People in this room that I know, I was with Brian Lever the other day, I constantly meet people from Edgware. It's made the most enormous impact on my life. I believe the stones, the tablets for the prayer for the royal family are in memory of my late mother who died when she was only 43, and it was a very big tragedy for us and for the community. And yet, this community that was small at that time took us into their hearts, and somehow we all coped with it. What can I say? It's wonderful to be here. I think your speech was marvellous. This isn't the vote of thanks. And I'm deeply thrilled that my 2 married children and my 5 grandchildren belong to this shul. Some come more regularly than others. I was married here, I've stood here and listened to 3 bar mitzvahs, and it's lovely to be here tonight. And thank you for this wonderful speech.
I would also like to congratulate Mr. Lawrence on a wonderful, wonderful talk. I was either the 6th or 7th pupil at Rosh Pina. I know that Reverend Amius knocked on my mum and dad's door in the Grove in 1955, I believe, asking if Daddy would think about sending me to the school. And Daddy said at the time, yeah, she's only a girl, why not? So, but I spent very, very happy years at Rosh Pina. You haven't mentioned any of the shops that we all knew so well. And there was Mr. Dennerstein, the butcher, Joe Pelter, of course, Pelters. It was always a very, very Jewish area, as you did actually remark. But when we had people like Mr. Bornstein, Diane Swift, and the old gentleman that went to yeshiva with my Zayda, they all went to Slobodka together in Lithuania. And there was a very, very nice group of old Yiddish men that would meet together and learn together, drink Bronfen together. And this was a wonderful, wonderful area, right from when we moved in 1953. Thank you again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your excellent lecture. I'd just like some numbers. I have been told that 50 years ago in Edgware, 1,000 people went to shul on Shabbos morning, 900 to the United and 50 each to the other 2 shuls. And today, 1,000 still come on a Shabbos morning, except it's widely spread. Would you agree with those figures?
Well, you say 50 years ago, takes us back to the to the beginning of that era, 1968. In those days, when Yossi Malavani was the chazan here, up to that point of time, services began at 9:15 every Shabbos morning. Shortly after his arrival, it was moved back to 9 o'clock. If you arrived in this shul, and remembering, of course, there were 3 shuls only in the district, if you arrived at 9:30 in this shul, in the men's section, you hardly stood a chance of getting a seat. And that is absolutely correct. So, in those days, the vast majority of people who did go to shul came here. Yes, the Yeshurun did have a reasonable attendance. The Adas in 68 was really quite small, but there were a few people there. The vast majority, overwhelmingly, was in this shul. Now, I don't know what the statistics are for all the other different places. I can't seem to keep pace with them as they open up. But you also have to remember, things have developed, as I think I've alluded to here. In this shul, we have more than one service. So people are spread out around this building from 7:15 every Shabbos morning. Then there's 8:15 minyan. Then there's the main minyan. Then there's the youth service. Then there's now the Emet service. So if you add all those people up together somewhere, the place will really be quite crowded here, apart from all the other places which have sprung up in over the years. I hope that answers the question. Helen.
Good evening. John, you spoke beautifully and you gave a marvellous history of this community and particularly this shul, which is my husband and I, our loved synagogue that we joined since the first week we were married, 1962. There's one thing that you've omitted, if you don't mind. I'd like to say that there are many congregations all over England, all over London, in Israel and whatever. But as you've said, so many people have come to this synagogue who have retired, who've got children living here, because Edgware, that I've witnessed in the last 57 years, is absolutely unique, because it's a community that you can join any shul, you can be a member of any synagogue, but you can walk into any synagogue and you're given a wonderful welcome. And I think we can all hold our head up in pride. This community is unique. Just wanted to mention that.
Can I just say this, Helen, that I have expressed to people many times that Edgware has a number of synagogues, but it's one community. And I hope and I pray that that is the way it will always remain. It is not quite as unified as it used to be. There was a time when you went out on Shabbos and you knew everybody in the street. Whoever you passed said good Shabbos. This does not necessarily happen today, and I know that it is something which has irritated a lot of people, some of whom are in the hall today. It's rude not to say good Shabbos. For those of you that might understand Yiddish, and I don't know if anybody does, the late Diane Fisher once stopped somebody who passed him by on Shabbos, and he called him back, and he said to him, Reb Yid, komm her. Herzlich ein, he said. Wenn ein Yid geht vorbei an anderer Yid on Shabbos, sagt man good Shabbos. If one Jew passes another one on Shabbos, you say good Shabbos. And he was entirely right. And he was a man of the old school, one of which we were very, very proud. And I think a lot of young people would do well if they took their cue from it. I'd like now to call on Rabbi Julian Singer to propose the vote of that.
I don't it. I only decided at the last minute that I was going to come along here this evening, so I don't need it. I usually give a shir at this time. I've managed to get the participants of the shir to defer it till 10 o'clock, so I could come along. So I was very interested, to hear what John would say. I've known him, I think, personally since about 1961. I grew up here. My parents moved here when they first got married after the war, and they lived initially in Kenilworth Road, but then they moved to Mowbray Road, where I grew up, and indeed the Perlmutters, who were new immigrants, I was already about 11 years old when they moved into Edgware. And they were very dear friends and very good neighbours. But John has, for those of us who did grow up here years ago, and even for the more recent emigres to this area, you evoked a lot of memories. You mentioned a lot of personalities. I could see some of them, in my mind. You very tactfully left out all the arguments and broiguses and somebody asked me, we moved back to Edgware. I left here in about 1968, 69 when I went to university. My parents subsequently moved out of the area. So I only came back to live here about 18 years ago when I left my shul in Muswell Hill. And of course, the Edgware I came back to is a very different place. These days, people ask me, what is it like in Edgware? I say, well, it's like this. You can be broigus with 15 shuls and still have somewhere to go and daven. It's true. Inevitably, and it's amazing how much you managed to pack in to the time, inevitably it would only be a series of snapshots. But just a couple of thoughts that I had. I was very close to Reverend Fagan Oliver Sholem. I had bar mitzvah lessons with him. His son Stephen was a personal friend, and he had the same bar mitzvah siddur as me, so he taught me my bar mitzvah. This is Stephen. Most of my basic, translation, everything I think you had to do years ago for the old bar mitzvah test, which was a proper test, I got from them. And actually, all these things, and I nusach tefillah from listening to him, all these things came in very handy later on when I eventually, went into the ministry myself. I do remember very much when Chazan Malavani arrived here. When he came for his trial Shabbos, I was conducting the choir. I was only about 16 or something at the time. And eventually he got the job, he started here, and the people that sat around where my late father sat in shul, I remember particularly Mr. Miro and Sid Balin. There were a few people. The services were regularly finishing about 1:45 on a Shabbos morning, and they used to wish each other well over the fast. The other person that came to mind was Mr. Grossman, the Shamus. He was really archetypal old beadle of the old traditional United Synagogue style. I didn't know that Mr. Grossman had feet, actually, because he used to wear the full canonicals, and it went right down to the floor, and he just kind of glide down the carpets, going shh to people who were making a noise. You're quite right, the shul was packed up pretty through the 1960s. I certainly remember the shul was packed out, the bar mitzvahs almost every week. And it was really, but to be here on Kol Nidre night, with the shul, the hall, the stage, the place packed up, it was really, as a young boy, it was really quite an occasion. I think that there, of course, were a lot of other communal activities that went on here. Obviously, the stalwarts of the Ladies' Guild, who, I mean, in my shul when I was in Muswell Hill, the most important people were in the following order: A, the caretaker, who could open up the building; B, the chairman of the Ladies' Guild. I was somewhere about 5th or 6th in the pecking order. But they I'm sure, have done sterling work over the years. And many other communal activities that this building was a centre for: the scouts, the guides, and certainly the very large cheder that we had here. All of this, I think you were able to evoke so much in your address. And I think that I think you have made the point, but I'd like to emphasize it, that so many of the successes that have happened latterly and developments in the community that have happened latterly are all built on the shoulders of what went before. The people that started this community up in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, before things really got going. Everything else that's happened since then has really been, nobody started from scratch. They were able to build on what there was before. So I think I have to leave it there. We'll give a share to give now. So I don't want to prolong this anymore, other than on behalf of everybody, to thank you so much. You obviously put in a lot of work to construct this. I hope the written version does see the light of day before too long. You've got a lot of work to do. This community it's still work in progress. There are many more years ahead. And I think the other point that I'd make, just briefly, it occurs to me that according to the law of shuls, this shul should be dead by now, right? Because what tends to happen is people move out to a new area, they get together, they start a shul, maybe it takes 10, 20 years to get going, and it sails along for about 50 years, and then everybody moves out the community, the children, and it just goes into decline. For all sorts of reasons, and some of them are in spite of the activities of everybody here, people have continued to move into Edgware, and therefore Edgware has bucked that particular trend, and it's really a pleasure to see, what goes on in this community, in the general community. And so Spencer just sort of picked on me as the first hapless person walking in through the door this evening. He asked me to give this vote of thanks. But on behalf of everybody here, we'd like to thank you and hope you enjoy this. Please drink responsibly.